Imagine a time when the punishment for even the slightest of crimes was so brutal, it left no chance of survival. A time when an unforgiving system of justice took the most extreme measures to deter lawbreakers. Methods so horrific that they would make even the strongest shudder in fear. The medieval period, a time filled with power struggles, kings and peasants, also brought with it a reign of terrifying punishments. One of the most dreaded forms of punishment during this time was known as bone crushing. Devices like the bone crusher and the breaking wheel were used not only to inflict unbearable pain, but also to ensure that the punishment itself was a public spectacle, an example to others. These devices were far more than just tools of execution. They represented the dark side of justice. But why were these methods so harsh? Were they meant solely for deterrence? Or was it something deeper? Perhaps even a symbol of the era's view on crime, power, and fear. Today, we dive deep into the history of these methods, exploring the deadly bone crusher and the infamous breaking wheel. We will also discuss one of the most famous historical cases where these punishments were carried out. But as we journey through this dark chapter in history, we want to ask you, the viewer, what would you have thought if you were alive during this time? Would you have supported such brutal justice, or would you have opposed it? Before we start, make sure to hit subscribe to our channel, ACIENT ECHO, for more captivating historical journeys. And don't forget to like this video if you find these stories as fascinating as we do. Now, let's step back into the medieval era and uncover the dark history of bone-crushing punishments. To truly understand the brutality of medieval punishments, it's essential to step back and explore the context in which these punishments were applied. The medieval period, spanning from roughly the 5th to the late 15th century, was a time of constant upheaval, violence, and strict societal hierarchies. Kings, feudal lords, and the church wielded enormous power, and the law was seen not as a tool for justice, but as a means to maintain order through fear. In medieval society, there was a clear distinction between the upper and lower classes. For the common people, life was harsh, and crime, whether it was theft, rebellion, or even disobedience, was seen as a direct challenge to the existing power structures. The wealthy and powerful elites viewed the law as a way to maintain control, and punishments were designed not only to correct behavior, but to set an example for others. In a world where resources were scarce and power was concentrated in the hands of a few, the legal system of the time was often harsh. The authorities believed that extreme punishments, such as the bone-crushing devices we'll discuss today, were necessary to instill fear and maintain order. Crime was not just seen as an individual act, but as a threat to the very structure of society. Therefore, punishments needed to be public, excruciating, and permanent. They had to send a clear message to everyone who might think about breaking the law. While we might view these punishments as grotesque today, for medieval society, they were seen as just. The belief in divine retribution also played a significant role. Punishments, such as death by the breaking wheel, were not only legal measures, but also acts of divine judgment. One such famous case was that of Joan of Arc, who was burned at the stake after being convicted of heresy and witchcraft. While she wasn't subjected to bone-crushing punishment, her execution served as an example of the kind of extreme measures used to deal with those seen as a threat to authority. But the case we will focus on today is the use of the breaking wheel. This device was frequently used to punish those accused of particularly heinous crimes, and its infamy stems from the gruesome way in which it was applied. The wheel itself symbolized not only the brutality of the law, but also the inescapable grip of the authorities. As we explore these historical punishments, it's important to remember that not all of them were seen as unjust during their time. But what about now? Do you think these methods could ever be justified in modern society? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you're interested in more fascinating historical stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to ACIENT ECHO and click the bell icon to stay updated on our latest videos. Among the most horrific devices used during the medieval period were those specifically designed to break bones and leave their victims in a state of permanent suffering. These machines were crafted with precision, designed to ensure that the punishment was not only torturous, but also prolonged, ensuring maximum agony. The bone crusher was one such device. It was often a large mechanical contraption designed to snap the bones of the victim's limbs, sometimes even crushing the skull. Imagine the weight of the machine pressing down on an individual, forcing them into unbearable contortions, their bones snapping under the pressure. Another infamous instrument of torture and execution was the breaking wheel. This device was known by many names: Catherine wheel, wheel of death, and simply the wheel. Victims were strapped to the wheel, their limbs broken, and sometimes they were left to die while being exposed to the public eye. This was done to ensure that everyone saw the consequences of disobedience. The operation of these devices was designed with one sole purpose in mind: infliction of pain. The bone crusher, for instance, would involve placing a person in a lying position with their limbs stretched out. The machine's massive gears would be slowly tightened until the bones began to break, the victim often losing consciousness from the shock and pain before succumbing to death. The breaking wheel, on the other hand, had a much more gruesome procedure. Victims were first struck across the limbs to break their bones. Then their bodies were tied to the wheel. The executioner would either finish the job by decapitating the victim or leave them to die of internal injuries, sometimes over the span of several days. The wheel would spin slowly, symbolizing the slow, inevitable death of the victim. Both devices were public spectacles. It was common for executions to be held in town squares or public areas, where crowds would gather to witness the suffering of the condemned. These scenes were meant to send a strong message: disobey the law, and this is your fate. The effects of such brutal punishments were not only physical, but deeply psychological. Victims, if they survived the initial trauma, were often left with lifelong disabilities, their bodies marked by permanent scars. Some would have limbs permanently deformed, while others suffered from chronic pain, unable to live a normal life. The psychological toll was equally devastating. Imagine living in a society where the threat of such a punishment loomed over your head for even the smallest of crimes. It created a climate of fear, not just from the government, but from the very people around you. The concept of justice in the medieval world was as much about control and intimidation as it was about fairness. One infamous example of the use of the breaking wheel was the case of Franz Joseph Maximilian. He was a young nobleman who, in a fit of rage, killed a member of the royal family. The punishment for his crime was brutal and swift. Franz was tied to the wheel, his limbs shattered by the executioner's strikes, and left to die in front of a crowd. His execution became a symbol of the ruthlessness of medieval justice, but Franz's case also showed something else: the power of the ruling class. Despite being a nobleman, his crime was so egregious that he was subjected to the same horrific fate as the lowest commoner. What do you think about the idea of public executions in the past? Were they truly effective in maintaining order, or were they just a way for the authorities to display their control? Comment below with your thoughts, and remember to like the video if you find these historical insights fascinating. This section explains the mechanisms behind the bone-crushing devices in a vivid but respectful manner, emphasizing the sheer terror and impact these methods had on the people of that era. It also connects to a famous historical case, showing how these punishments were applied even to those in power. Shall we proceed with the next section? The wheel, a horror of its own. One of the most notorious methods of punishment in the medieval era was execution by the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel. This device, though it may sound less frightening by name, was perhaps one of the most terrifyingly gruesome forms of public execution ever devised. It was not just about death. It was about delivering pain in its most unimaginable form, and the wheel itself became a symbol of unrelenting punishment. At its core, the breaking wheel was a large wooden wheel, often placed horizontally or upright, to which the condemned would be strapped. The executioner's job was to break the limbs of the victim with heavy tools, leaving them disjointed and immobilized. But the real terror came when the victim's body was placed on the wheel for public display. The symbolism of the wheel represented not just death, but the unavoidable end of all those who dared challenge the laws of the time. The procedure for breaking wheel executions was a carefully orchestrated series of steps. First, the victim was typically knocked unconscious or severely beaten before being placed on the wheel. They would be laid out on the wheel's spokes, their limbs often broken, sometimes even shattered by the blunt force of a hammer or axe. In some cases, the body was then spun on the wheel to showcase the condemned to the crowd, who watched with bated breath as the individual suffered and, eventually, died. This slow process was meant to heighten the excruciating nature of the punishment. If the victim was still alive after the initial phase, some executioners would leave them to die slowly, sometimes over the course of several days. The process was made even more horrific by the public spectacle of it all. The wheel was often displayed in a prominent area where crowds would gather, ensuring that the punishment wasn't just a means of retribution, but a tool of fear for everyone who witnessed it. The breaking wheel wasn't just a form of execution. It had deep cultural significance in medieval society. To the people at the time, it symbolized divine justice, the idea that God had chosen the victim to face such a punishment. In a society that saw itself as divinely ordered, the breaking wheel served as a stark reminder that lawlessness would be met with the harshest of retributions. In some places, the wheel was even considered a form of purification, a way to rid the world of the corrupt and to cleanse society of those who had sinned. This concept is what made the punishment not only physical, but spiritual. In the eyes of the medieval population, the use of the wheel was especially common in the Holy Roman Empire and later in France, where its symbolism resonated with the deep religious convictions of the people. One of the most famous cases of a breaking wheel execution was that of Peter the Hermit, a well-known religious figure who was convicted of heresy. His execution was carried out in front of a crowd, and it became one of the most infamous public executions of the time. Peter's limbs were shattered, and his body was placed on the wheel for everyone to see, symbolizing the ultimate fall from grace for someone who had once been a spiritual leader. Peter's execution not only demonstrated the power of the authorities, but also highlighted the vulnerability of even those who held influential positions in society. It showed that no one was above the law, and that punishment, no matter how brutal, could reach anyone. This form of punishment might seem unimaginable today, but it was once a real threat for many. How do you think the medieval justice system influenced the development of our own modern systems of punishment? Could such practices ever return in a different form, even today? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe for more deep dives into history's most shocking moments. In this section, we've explored the horrifying details of the breaking wheel, its function, and its cultural impact. By bringing in a historical case, we've reinforced the brutal nature of the punishment, making the audience reflect on the role of punishment in medieval times. Shall we move forward with the next section, legal and social views on these punishments? In medieval society, the general public's view on punishments like the breaking wheel and bone crusher was often shaped by their belief in the divine right of kings and the absolute power of the ruling class. For the common people, these brutal punishments were a stark reminder of the consequences of disobedience, but also a demonstration of order in a world that could seem chaotic and unpredictable. Many believed that such severe measures were necessary to maintain peace and stability. The concept of deterrence was central to medieval justice. The fear of seeing someone suffer on the wheel or in the crushing machine was enough to instill discipline in the population, even if it meant that the punishment was disproportionate to the crime. The more gruesome and public the punishment, the more effective it was believed to be in discouraging others from breaking the law. However, not everyone agreed with such brutal measures. While the ruling elite saw these executions as necessary to maintain order, many within the population began to question the fairness of such punishment. As medieval society evolved, ideas about human dignity, mercy, and justice slowly began to take root, leading to the eventual decline of such practices. The conflict between law and morality is perhaps the most poignant aspect of the use of these horrific punishments. On one hand, the law was supposed to provide a means of order and justice. On the other hand, the cruelty of the punishment raised serious moral concerns. Was it truly just to inflict such extreme pain on another human being, even if they had committed a crime? The medieval concept of divine retribution played a significant role in this moral justification. People believed that those who committed heinous crimes were not only breaking earthly laws, but were also offending God. Therefore, their suffering was seen as a form of divine justice, cleansing them of their sins. This idea allowed authorities to reconcile the brutality of these punishments with their moral compass, believing they were acting on behalf of a higher power. As society became more enlightened, the moral implications of such punishments began to be questioned. Philosophers and scholars began to argue that true justice could not be achieved through suffering, and that mercy and rehabilitation should be considered as parts of the justice process. The transition toward more humane forms of punishment started to gain ground, especially with the advent of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. While the breaking wheel and bone crusher were infamous in medieval Europe, similar forms of brutal punishment existed around the world. In Asia, for instance, the practice of crushing bones was used in certain regions, although the methods were often different. The Chinese and Japanese empires employed a variety of torturous punishments, some of which involved breaking limbs or crushing skulls to punish criminals and political enemies. The Mughal Empire in India also used cruel methods, including breaking the bones of rebels and criminals as a form of deterrence. In Japan, the concept of seppuku, or harakiri, involved the ritual disembowelment of oneself, often after being dishonored. While this punishment was self-inflicted, it was rooted in similar ideals of honor and the extreme consequences of failure, much like the medieval punishments in Europe. Despite the geographical differences, these similar practices highlight how punishment in ancient and medieval times was not just about retribution, but about public spectacle, designed to instill fear in the population. As we've seen, the line between justice and cruelty was often blurred in the past. Do you think there are times when severe punishment is justified? Or do you believe that mercy should always prevail? Share your opinion in the comments, and remember to subscribe to ACIENT to continue exploring the most fascinating aspects of history. This section delves into how medieval society viewed these brutal punishments and the moral conflict that arose from them. It also ties in global perspectives on similar punishments, offering a broader context. Would you like to proceed with the next section? The fall of these punishments. By the late medieval period, the use of bone-crushing punishments like the breaking wheel began to fall out of favor. This shift was not sudden. It was a gradual process influenced by several factors, including philosophical advancements, religious reforms, and the changing political landscape. As Europe entered the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods, there was a growing push for more humane treatment of prisoners and a re-evaluation of what constituted justice. One of the driving forces behind the decline of these brutal punishments was the rise of more humanitarian values. The idea that punishment should aim not just to inflict pain, but to rehabilitate offenders, began to take root in intellectual circles. Philosophers like Cesare Beccaria, who published his work on crimes and punishments in 1764, advocated for a system of justice that focused on fairness and proportionality, rather than torture and public humiliation. Along with the rise of philosophical ideals, the political landscape of Europe also began to change. With the growth of centralized monarchies and later constitutional governments, there was a shift in how justice was administered. Kingdoms and empires began to recognize that more efficient and fair judicial systems would lead to a more stable society. Reforms were introduced, and new methods of punishment were put in place. Instead of public executions and torturous punishments, imprisonment became more common. Prisons were initially places where those awaiting trial were held, but over time, they evolved into punitive institutions aimed at rehabilitation and reform, rather than spectacles of suffering. The introduction of the guillotine in France during the French Revolution marked a symbolic end to the medieval era of gruesome executions. Although still deadly, the guillotine was considered more humane because it was quick and didn't involve prolonged suffering. It was a symbol of the changing attitudes towards punishment and capital punishment. The fall of these medieval punishments marked a turning point in how society viewed justice and the treatment of criminals. No longer were they seen as vessels of divine wrath. Instead, society began to ask, what is the true purpose of punishment? Is it about justice, or is it about control? This reflection also led to the abolition of many cruel practices worldwide. As human rights movements gained momentum in the 19th and 20th centuries, the understanding that torture and inhumane punishments were unjust became the foundation for modern law. In places like Japan, China, and the Middle East, some of the harsh methods of punishment continued well into the modern era. But even these regions began to evolve. Japan, for instance, officially abolished severe torture in the Meiji era, 1868-1912, following the global movement toward more humane justice systems. In China, public execution was still practiced well into the 20th century. But today, executions are far less common, and there is more emphasis on the reformation of criminals. Many countries around the world, through a mixture of internal reform and international pressure, began to recognize that modern justice systems should not rely on fear, but on the rehabilitation of offenders. As we look back at these medieval punishments, it's hard to imagine such cruelty ever being justified. But the past has shaped the present, and we've learned valuable lessons on the importance of human dignity and fairness in justice. What do you think about the evolution of punishment? Should there still be room for severe punishments in our society, or has humanity learned enough to move beyond them? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's most shocking and thought-provoking moments. Famous historical cases of bone-crushing punishments. Case study 1. The execution of Franz Joseph Maximilian, one of the most famous and brutal executions using the breaking wheel, was that of Franz Joseph Maximilian, a nobleman in the Holy Roman Empire, who, despite his status, became the victim of this horrific punishment. Franz, a young man from a powerful family, had been accused of committing treason, a crime deemed unforgivable by the authorities at the time. His punishment was not only public, but designed to make an example out of him. After being convicted, Franz was tied to the breaking wheel, and his limbs were systematically shattered. His body, weakened and broken, was then left on display as a public spectacle. The execution served two purposes: to punish Franz for his crime, and to send a chilling message to anyone who might challenge the authority of the empire. The public nature of the punishment, coupled with its cruelty, was meant to instill fear across the population, ensuring compliance with the laws of the land. What makes the case of Franz Joseph Maximilian even more terrifying is not just the physical suffering he endured, but the psychological toll of such a brutal execution. For those who witnessed it, the spectacle was meant to shock, awe, and terrify them into obedience. The idea was simple: look at Franz's fate and remember, this could be you. The concept of public executions served as both a deterrent and a demonstration of power. The authorities believed that by making examples of high-profile figures, they could maintain social order. But as the centuries went on, this type of justice, both cruel and public, began to fall out of favor. The world began to question whether this spectacle of suffering truly served a just purpose, or simply reinforced fear and control. Case study 2. The execution of Peter the Hermit. Another case that stands out is that of Peter the Hermit, a religious figure from medieval Europe who was accused of heresy and witchcraft. Despite his influential position as a spiritual leader, Peter was convicted by the authorities and subjected to the breaking wheel. His crime was seen as one of the greatest offenses in the medieval world, questioning the church and divine authority. Peter's execution was not just a punishment, but a public display of the church's dominance. His limbs were shattered, and his body was left on the wheel for the crowd to witness. The message was clear. No one, not even religious figures, was immune from the reach of the law. The execution of Peter the Hermit also underscored the hypocrisy that existed in medieval justice. Despite his role as a religious leader, Peter was subjected to the same brutal treatment as common criminals. This paradox led to growing dissatisfaction with the medieval justice system, sparking debates about fairness and morality in the administration of law. Case study: the execution of Joan of Arc. While not a case involving bone crushing directly, the execution of Joan of Arc serves as an important example of medieval injustice and the brutal punishments that were often used against women accused of heresy. Joan, a young peasant girl who became a French military leader, was captured by the English during the 100 Years' War and accused of witchcraft and heresy. Despite her heroism on the battlefield, she was burned at the stake in 1431. Joan's case highlights the misuse of punishment for political gain. Her execution was a way for the English to both silence a threat and demonize a symbol of French nationalism. Joan of Arc's trial and execution sparked outrage across Europe, particularly among the French. And later, her canonization by the Catholic Church as a martyr further solidified her place as a symbol of injustice and the corrupt nature of medieval law. These cases of bone-crushing and public executions were not only acts of brutal justice, but they also left lasting marks on the societies that witnessed them. The extreme nature of these punishments led to a growing sense of injustice that contributed to the eventual decline of such practices. As the Enlightenment gained traction, thinkers began to question whether justice should be about retribution or rehabilitation. The growing movement toward human rights and the abolition of torture created the framework for modern justice systems, which, though far from perfect, focus on fairness and rehabilitation rather than cruelty and fear. The brutal executions of these historical figures remind us of how far we've come in understanding justice. Do you believe that modern justice systems still have remnants of the medieval practices? Or have we completely moved away from such cruelty? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. As we journeyed through the dark and horrifying world of medieval punishments, we've uncovered the brutal reality faced by those accused of crimes during the medieval period. The bone crusher, breaking wheel, and other horrific devices were more than just methods of execution. They were public spectacles designed to instill fear, remind society of the power of the authorities, and showcase the injustice of the time. We've seen how these methods evolved from the early Middle Ages, when public execution was viewed as a form of divine judgment, to the eventual decline of such brutal practices as humanitarian values and the ideas of justice and mercy began to take root. These changes sparked the shift toward more humane punishments and the modern concept of rehabilitative justice. The famous historical cases, from Franz Joseph Maximilian to Joan of Arc, remind us that even the most powerful individuals were not immune from the relentless power of medieval justice. These cases also highlight the hypocrisy and political manipulation embedded in the justice system of the time, prompting us to reflect on how far we've come and the importance of a fair legal system today. Looking back at these dark chapters of history, it's hard to imagine such cruelty ever being justified. But the medieval era was a time when fear ruled, and punishment was not about fairness or rehabilitation. It was about control, power, and spectacle. The question remains, what lessons have we learned? While we no longer rely on such barbaric punishments, there are still moments in history and in modern society where we see echoes of that desire for public control and fear-based justice. As we continue to evolve as a society, we must ask ourselves, how do we balance justice and mercy? How do we ensure that our punishments today don't lose sight of human dignity? The medieval methods may be long gone, but the reflection on their consequences remains as relevant as ever. As we conclude this exploration into the dark history of medieval punishments, we want to hear your thoughts. Do you think society can ever revert to such extreme punishments again? Or have we truly evolved beyond that? Leave your comments below and join the conversation. If you enjoyed learning about this dark chapter of history, Make sure to subscribe to our channel, ACIENT ECHO, and click the bell icon so you don't miss out on future deep dives into history's most shocking moments. Share this video with friends and family who would also be fascinated by the evolution of justice through the ages.